Good morning. Today, our guest is Professor Guido Alfani, and we're going to be talking about pandemics. Hello, Professor Alfani. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm fine, and I hope it's the same for you.
Yes, it's great. It's great. I've been wanting to get you for a long time, since last year. Now, today we're going to be
Okay.
talking about your paper that was recently published by the Journal of Economic Literature titled Epidemics, Inequality, and Poverty in Pre-Industrial and Early Industrial Times. What's the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic?
Well, it is mostly a difference of spread because an epidemic simply refers, the term epidemic simply refers to the increase in the cases of a specific infection in a given geographic area, while a pandemic is properly defined as an infection which manages to spread across many continents. Okay, today we expect a pandemic to spread across all continents, but in a historical setting, it's not possible because, of course, before the onset of Atlantic trade, some continents were not connected by communication routes, basically. So we only want that the pandemic actually affects more continents to call it a pandemic.
Professor Alfani, this is your area of expertise. Could you tell us about some of the biggest plagues in history, like the Justinian plague, for example? How
Yeah.
dangerous was the Justinian plague?
Well, the Justinian plague in the 6th century of the current era killed a very large percentage of the people living in the broader Mediterranean area. Okay, it's a bit difficult to estimate how many people died, but it might have been the mortality might have been in the range of 40 to 50%. And this also had vast consequences because it appears, for example, that the spread of this plague led to the end of the ambitions of Emperor Justinian. He was the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, basically to renew the old empire and then to reconquer the whole of Italy and other areas which had been part of the Roman Empire in earlier epochs. But we don't know that much about this specific pandemic. We know much more about the Black Death of the 14th century. So plague had disappeared from Europe and the Mediterranean from about the 8th century. It was unknown to people of medieval Europe. It came back to Europe at the end of 1347 and basically took everybody unaware. And in this case, we still have some uncertainty, in terms of mortality rates. It's difficult to estimate them based on the available sources, but it is clear that at the very least, the Black Death killed 1/4 of the people living in Europe and the Mediterranean, but probably the real mortality was much closer to 50%. So the current estimates tend to be around half the population of Europe and the Mediterranean killed by the Black Death in the 14th century. And thereafter, the plague remained endemic in Europe and the Mediterranean. We don't know exactly which were the areas where it remained endemic, and there is a lot of research ongoing based on paleobiological evidence. So basically, researchers look into the skeletal remains of people buried in plague cemeteries and look for traces of the DNA of the pathogen, which is called Yersinia pestis. And the problem, my problem as a historian with all that is only that the reconstruction they provide us with tends to change continuously, and this is because a lot of research is ongoing, and each new discovery basically tends to change a bit the picture that we have about the patterns of spread of plague between Europe, Asia, and North Africa mostly.
Where did the Black Death originate? there is some present debate taking place about the origin of the Black Death. Do we have a conclusive answer?
Okay, my personal opinion is no, so we do not have a conclusive answer. Not yet, at least. The old view was that the Yersinia pestis bacillus was endemic in the Himalaya area. Then when the Mongols expanded their empire, reached this area, they got in contact with the animal reservoir of the Yersinia pestis, basically rodents living in those mountains. They got infected, and then they spread the plague to across Central Asia until reaching Europe by means of their quite efficient communication routes. The Mongol Empire had restored the ancient Silk Road, and pathogens travel very easily along communication routes, basically. Then in 1347, they are besieging a Genoese colony in Crimea, a colony called Kaffa, and according to a chronicle that we have, some galleys escape the city of Kaffa in order to escape the infection, basically, because the Mongols had brought the infection to Kaffa. They had to leave the siege because the army had become infected, but the city itself had become infected. So these Genoese galleys, in fact, in 1347, first Constantinople, and then some cities in South Italy, Messina in particular, and then maybe also Marseille, and from there, the infection spreads everywhere. More recently, the hypothesis has been made that the origin of the plague, of the Black Death, is to be placed in Central Asia instead, so much closer to Europe. There is also a recent article of Nature which reports the finding of traces of the Yersinia pestis bacillus in Central Asian cemeteries, I think dating to the 1310s, if I remember correctly, because this is very new and I haven't read the article yet. I only watched it for the moment. And this is clearly a bit of evidence which supports the idea that the Black Death originates in Central Asia. But as I said, as a user of this literature, and as I say a user because it's not my personal job to work with skeletal remains of plague cemeteries. I do something different. I also work on another kind of sources, more recent, and they tend to be kind of written sources in my case. But my point is only that as a user of this literature, I notice that the picture that we have changes continuously as this research is really moving very quickly. So right now, I would say that it seems relatively probable, so possible, but even maybe probable that the Black Death originated in Central Asia, so in an area closer to Europe, but still there is much which remains mysterious about its origin, and maybe even more about its subsequent spread in Europe, especially when moving from the first wave, so from the Black Death proper to the subsequent plague waves, which continue to affect Europe in the centuries following the Black Death.
How did the Black Death affect labor?
Yeah. So the Black Death, by killing half the people, also killed, of course, half the workers in the affected area, and this created a shortage of labor, a bad shortage of labor. So on the eve of the Black Death, in Europe especially, population had become very dense, and there was a lot of demographic pressure on the available resources. So basically, resources were scarce and laborers were abundant. After the Black Death, after half the workers had been killed, basically, the situation is the opposite. So the workers have become scarce, and resources, for example, land, have become abundant. And this, of course, allows the worker to try and get better conditions, as I usually describe this as, the workers finding that they have the knife in the hand and they use it. And we know that urban workers experience significant increases in their real wages. There is a debate about this, but the general pattern is quite clear, pretty much everywhere in Europe and the Mediterranean, almost everywhere to be precise, because there are some areas at the geographic periphery which experience different patterns due to their specific conditions. But almost everywhere, we have evidence that real wages were increasing in real terms quite a bit after the Black Death. We also have evidence that peasants working in the countryside, including, for example, sharecroppers, were able to get better conditions from their employers. In the past, the period after Black Death has been defined a golden age for labor. That is maybe excessive, but I don't know any specialist of the Middle Ages who negate the fact that for the common people, the aftermath of the Black Death was characterized by relatively good working conditions. So in that case, due to extremely high mortality and due to a context in which nobody was ready to face the plague, we have an increase in real wages. And interestingly, this happens also against the institutions, because in some parts of Europe, for example, in the Florentine state in Italy, there were attempts at avoiding that the wages of the workers increased. These were called in Latin laws contra laboratores, which means against the workers, right? So laws against the workers, or more precisely, against the unreasonable requests of the workers. And these laws try to place a cap on the wages paid to the workers, but they couldn't work, and they were in the end repelled everywhere. They couldn't work because the workers were scarce, the Black Death had affected everybody. If the worker in Tuscany, in the Florentine state, was unable to get a better wage, he would simply have moved to another part of Italy or Europe where wages were higher. Okay, so there was a lot of competition for these scarce workers, and this is why these attempts at avoiding increases in wages finally failed.
Guido, did the Black Death lower inequality?
Yeah, the Black Death did, as far as we know, in virtually all cases for which we have evidence concerning wealth inequality, usually because evidence about income inequality is very difficult to get for the Middle Ages, at least direct evidence. But for wealth inequality, we have good information about the distribution of wealth at the household level. And sometimes we have information before and after the Black Death, and in virtually all cases, we find a very substantial decline in wealth inequality, which is reasonable if you think about it, because we know from other sources that real wages were increasing. So you have more people who have the means to acquire property, sometimes for the first time. On the other side, you have that land has become abundant, real estate in general has become abundant, so people are more willing to sell it in a cultural context in which you usually don't sell land unless you are really forced to do it. But in this situation, they had much more land and real estate than they wanted, and they were placing it on the market. On top of that, in much of Europe, including the south of Europe, inheritance systems were palatable on the eve of the Black Death, and then you have that this kind of mass mortality produces a fragmentation of the patrimonies, which spreads directly wealth, so leading to further declines in wealth inequality, but also make it so that people inherit real estate that they do not want, or inherit like inefficient plots, and then also these unwanted or inefficient inheritances are placed on the market. So you have more people willing and able to buy, more people selling real estate, so selling bits of wealth, basically. And this combination allows for a market in which it is exceptionally easy to achieve a redistribution of wealth, in the end, to the advantage mostly of the middling and lower ranks of society. Those who suffer more, the only ones who actually suffered in distributional terms, in this period are the richest individuals. Those at the top of the wealth distribution.
Guido, plagues, do they disproportionately affect the poor? Because I read your article and you were arguing that plagues tend to disproportionately affect people who were already ill.
Yeah, that is correct. Now, in the case of the Black Death, we have some evidence that people who also had some condition, who were frail because of disease or for other reasons, tended to die a bit more than the others. But in general, we don't have such good information about the selectivity of the Black Death by socioeconomic status. And the general picture of a universal killer is, I believe, more or less correct. From the end of the 15th century, however, we have quite strong evidence that plague had acquired a more clear social economic character. And this is also something that doctors of the time were declaring. So from the end of the 15th century, the doctors, those who wrote treatises about plague, tended to assert that plague was basically an infection of the poor. And we can see that because we see, for example, when we can observe the relative spread of a plague in a city, we see, for example, that it tends to affect more and to kill more the poorest quarters of the city. This happens, for example, in London in early modern times. This happened in Milan, in Italy, in early modern times. So, yes, from the end of the Middle Ages on, plague tended to kill more the poor. This was due to a combination of factors, probably their poorer health, to their lower health conditions to begin with. The fact that that in cities they lived in very crowded quarters might have favored the spread of the infection among them, so leading to higher mortality in this social economic group. But at the same time, the fact that plague had become or was considered an infection of the poor tended public institutions to implement strategies for limiting the spread of plague in cities, which might have led to hypermortality among the poor on their own. Because, for example, in Italy, at the first suspicion of plague in a city, you have that all the poor immigrants who have no rights of citizenship, so they have no right to remain within the city walls, are expelled, and these people tend to die of plague or of hunger beyond the city walls, or in the countryside, or just off the city walls. Those who instead, the poor who instead have a right to remain within the city walls, are placed in specific institutions, the plague wards. So they are like brought forcefully even to these places to prevent the spread of the plague in these cities. But there, in these plague wards, they might have experienced a higher risk of becoming infected and of dying of plague because they were living in an even more crowded and unhealthy environment. And this fact, the selectivity of plague by socioeconomic status, is something which is very important to remember, because we have, when we look at evidence about how a measure of plague reduced poverty, and this happens at the time of the Black Death, but this also happens in the main plagues of early modern times, for example, the reduction of poverty might happen because of two very different mechanisms. These mechanisms probably are always active together, right? But at the time of the Black Death, we have the prevailing mechanism probably is redistribution towards the poor for the reasons which I've discussed. In early modern times, instead, when even the largest plagues, and I'm referring to episodes which were able to lead to a mortality rate of the range of 30 to even 40%. But even then, were no longer able to reduce inequality. They were still able to reduce poverty, but the prevailing mechanism in this case was another, which was simple extermination of the poor. So they were reducing poverty not because the poor were getting something and were becoming less poor, but because they were dying much more than all other socioeconomic strata. So it's very difficult to disentangle these two, but it's pretty clear if we look at all the data we have that at the time of Black Death, the prevailing mechanism was redistribution. So this is kind of the virtuous mechanism, if you want. Virtuous, if we remember that it was achieved by a pandemic which killed half the people of Europe. Okay, so virtuous for the survivors, if you want. In the case of the main plagues of early modern times, especially the last big ones in the 17th century, the prevailing mechanism was instead extermination of the poor. There was maybe some redistribution, but it was very limited, also because at the time of 17th century plagues, the economic elites of Europe had become very good at preventing the kind of patrimonial fragmentation which had happened at the time of the Black Death. And they could do this because they were ready. They knew that a plague was something which could happen, while the economic elites had been taken unaware by the Black Death in the 14th century. Now they knew because they had seen that every few years a new plague wave affected their city, their country, their continent, whatever, okay? So they knew, and they had become ready by protecting the patrimony. They couldn't basically protect themselves or their descendants. What they could do was to protect the patrimony as a means to protect the welfare of the family across the generations. And they did this by changing the inheritance rules. The general inheritance rules in much of Europe remained partable, so everybody inherits the same share of the patrimony of the parents on principle, but it was possible to establish specific institutions, entails, called fideicomissum in Europe, generally speaking, in Latin, which basically made the bulk of the patrimony undivisible, right? So if the bulk of the patrimony is undivisible, if you have an episode of mass mortality, you don't have that kind of fragmentation, which will redistribute the largest patrimonies across many inheritors, because it's protected, the patrimony is protected precisely from this kind of pandemic threat.
Yes, Guido. I was actually planning to ask you that issue. How did the post-pandemic plagues fail to reduce inequality? But you have already answered it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
There is another aspect, if you want me to add to that,
You
which
could
is
please
this.
do.
Yeah. Another important aspect in this story is the level of mortality, because the way in which the Black Death reduced inequality was through mass mortality. Okay, so when you have a pandemic or an epidemic which kills a fewer percentage of the population, a smaller percentage of the population, then you can't expect to have the same impact on the labor market and then also the same kind of redistribution to higher wages and so forth and so on. So with lesser episodes, you can't expect large-scale distribution. The real issue is with the 17th century plagues, because the 17th century plagues were the ones closer to the Black Death in terms of mortality rates. As I mentioned, especially in the south of Europe, these were extremely bad in the south of Europe. In 1629-30, there is one which affects, for example, central northern Italy, and it kills about 35% of the population. Now, if the setting was the same as with the Black Death, you would expect the same trend in wealth inequality. Instead, you don't observe that. There is a very short-lived and small reduction in wealth inequality, which is compensated in just a few years after the 1630 plague. And the same happens in the 1656 plague in South Italy, the same happens in South France, the same happens in northeastern Spain. The exception to this story, the only exception we know of for now, is Germany. And this is because in Germany, you have the same plague which reaches Italy in 1629, you have it a few years before, because it spreads in Central Europe, moving from the north to the south. And that happens together with the most devastating military conflict of pre-industrial times, which is the 30 Years' War of 1618 to 1648. So the combination of these two events, an exceptionally destructive war, which really stands out from other conflicts of pre-industrial times because it leads to a huge amount of material destruction, plus the plague in the 1620s, which also in Germany was the worst plague after the Black Death, as far as we know. Well, the combination of them in this area is able to lead to inequality reduction. But here you have this added layer of huge material destruction of wealth. So again, you have a shortening of the distance between the wealthiest and the poorest people, but this is because a portion of the wealth of the rich is destroyed, right? Not because it is redistributed. And this is interesting because we have a similar dynamic in the 20th century when World War I and World War II were able to reduce inequality, but mostly by means of, not only, but mostly by means of destruction of physical and of financial capital. And this is not the kind of redistribution that you might want, of course, because you aren't improving the condition of the poor in terms of their absolute access to resources. You are simply reducing inequality, but not in the sense of giving something from the top to the bottom.
Professor Alfani, so we've been talking about pandemics and their impacts on inequality and wages, but the Black Death, again, did it result in a higher wages everywhere in Europe?
So in the case of the Black Death, we have some evidence that in areas of Europe, which are specific settings, and they tend to be at the geographic periphery, and I'm referring to especially to Spain and to Ireland as well, although for Ireland we don't have much documentation for this, so it's mostly like an hypothesis. But in these areas, things might have been different. And this is because they did not experience the condition prevailing across Europe at the time, which was one of very dense population and high demographic pressure on resources. The opposite was true. So population was relatively scarce in Spain from before the Black Death. This means that when the Black Death killed almost the population in Spain, instead of relieving a pressure which was not existent in this case, it led to the crumbling of a commercial economy which needed all the people which were there simply to maintain a network of cities trading one with the other. So this leads to a refragmentation of the Spanish economy. This leads to the crisis of this urban economy, and this also kind of prevents increases in real wages because there is a huge damage done to the demand of labor. Okay, so you have at the same time a reduction in the offer of labor and a reduction in the demand of labor. Something similar happens in Italy in the 17th century. The plagues affecting Southern Europe in the 17th century had very negative consequences in the long run. I already mentioned they did not reduce inequality. They did not even increase real wages in North Italy. And this is because these were like asymmetric shocks in the sense that they affected in this way South Europe, but they did not affect it in an early similar way the North of Europe. Okay, so the North of Europe was affected repeatedly by plagues in the 17th century, but these were relatively mild events compared to the single plague waves which affected these areas of South Europe, but which when they affected them, killed over a very short period of time a large part of the population. So there is a difference, okay? There's an epidemiological difference between the North and the South of Europe, which is kind of mysterious, but it's measurable, so it's there. And this also means that when these plagues kill 1/3 of the people of North Italy, in 1630, in a period when economic competition from Northern European countries, and in particular from the Low Countries, so the current Netherlands, the Dutch Republic, especially at the time. So competition was already very high. Italy was already suffering from the fact of having relatively difficult access to Atlantic trade routes. You have these atom bomb falling only on your country, and this is when the economic elites, the merchant elites, decide that they can't compete anymore. They can't compete anymore because they were already struggling to face this competition. They lose a significant part of their domestic market in an age of mercantilism, by the way. So when everybody was trying to protect its market against external merchants, basically, and then they decide that they can't do this anymore. So they move their investment from manufacture to land, in particular. And when they do, they, of course, reduce their demand of labor in cities. So you have, again, a shock to the demand of labor together with a shock to the offer of labor. And this is why we observe, and we observed it, actually, we have evidence about this, we observe that real wages do not increase after a plague which kills 1/3 of the workers. We would expect an increase, is that this does not happen. And of course, the fact that the merchant elites were moving to something different from trade and manufacture also contributes to explain the further rise in wealth inequality, because they are basically acquiring more land. They are building up even larger estates, basically. And they are then competing in a very different way on the land and house market. So, the process is kind of clear when you really think of it, but bringing all the bits together has been quite difficult. And again, there is something which remains mysterious, of course. So we have projects about exploring in detail what happens in the labor market in South Europe in the first half of the 17th century, because something again remains mysterious, and we would really like to observe more directly these dynamics in the urban labor market in particular. But in terms of general economic rationale, it is quite clear that the context in which a plague killing such a large part of the people happens shapes very significantly the outcome. So you can't simply expect that certain economic consequences will be only the consequence of a specific mortality rate, a specific percentage of people dying. There are other factors which also play a role, especially when you try and compare pandemics and epidemics which take place in different periods, sometimes centuries removed one from the other.
All right, so Professor Alfani, as I expected, you were an excellent guest, but unfortunately I have to go. But speaking to you has been a pleasure, and you have written several books. You have a new book out on pandemics. Our listeners need to go and get it. All right.
No, unfortunately, I do not have a new book out on pandemics. I have a forthcoming book on the history of the rich in the West in the long run. So this.
But you do have a book on pandemics. It's not new, but do you have a book on pandemics?
No, no. I have one in Italian, but this hasn't been translated, and this was published at the time of the swine flu influenza. So it's like 10 years ago and more.
Okay, all right then. You have several research articles on pandemics. I thought that one was a book.
Yes. Unfortunately, no.
All right. Okay then. Bye, Professor Alfani.
Bye. Bye.